The history textbook for grade 5, accepted for study in high school, reads, "The Battle of Kulikovo took place in September 1380 on a wide field at the confluence of the Don and Nepryadva rivers between the troops of Moscow Prince Dmitry Ivanovich and the ruler of the Golden Horde of the Tatar Temnik, warlord, Mamai. As a result of a bloody battle, Prince Dmitry, nicknamed Donskoy by his contemporaries, won. This victory put an end to the Tatar-Mongol yoke in Russia. Everything is simple and clear. The time and place of action are marked. The participants are named. One last thing that needs to be done is to go to the Tula region, where the Kulikovo field is located, and see this famous place with your own eyes. But what will we find there? Apart from the obelisk, erected in the middle of the 19th century, there is nothing to see there. No churches to the glory of victory, no burial mounds where the participants in the battle are buried, nothing. Certainly, more than 600 years is a long time. Mounds could be leveled and churches destroyed. Maybe there is something in the ground? After all, something must remain after the battle, in which tens of thousands of people died on both sides.
And it is very important to note that not only those arrowheads were found there and presented. Perhaps there are two the most convincing and serious, should I say, finds. First, a plate from the Golden Horde plate armor was found, and then, a year later, 40 meters from this place, a fragment of about 8 rings, such a trim, so to speak, of ancient Russian chainmail was found. They put on such things only for a fight, just before a battle. In everyday life, such things were not subject to 7-day wear. Because they were expensive, and because they were, in fact, heavy.
Since 1982, archaeologists have been continuously working on the field, and there were just 2 serious finds. Historians explain, any metal in those days was extremely valuable, so that most of the weapons and armor could be collected and immediately taken away from the battlefield, some later. For such a long time, some items rusted and completely decomposed. In addition, scientists refer to imperfection of the modern search methods.
The important point here is that in a year we cover no more than 10 hectares with help of metal detectors. And to date, a very, very modest territory has been covered.
And what about the remains of dead warriors? After all, the place of the battle should be literally littered with human bones. As the chronicles say, the bodies of enemies were not buried. Foreigners remained to lie where they died.
Our expedition, together with geophysicists, conducted geophysical research and found a very serious anomaly in all physical parameters, similar to a mass grave. But when we started working on this site, we were simply forced to stop working, since these works fell on a burial site of the years 20 to 30s of our century.
Summarize. At the site of the Great Battle, several items that were part of the warriors' equipment were found. Plus arrowheads that could have belonged to ordinary hunters. Plus some geophysical anomaly, whose nature is generally unknown. And that's all. How to explain such meager results? There can be only 2 explanations. Either scientists searched badly, or they searched in a wrong place. It is difficult to agree with the first. With the second, it is even more difficult, since it is known from school where the battle took place. But what about the facts? Let's try to figure it out. When and where did the mention of the battle on the Kulikovo field first appear? This is what Russian chronicles tell us, or rather, their copies, which have come down to us in a greatly distorted form. Here is what is written in the poetic story Zadonshchina, in the earliest chronicle dedicated to the Battle of Kulikovo.
To be a knock and a great thunder on the river Nepryadva, between the rivers Don and Dnieper. The field Kulikovo shall be covered with human corpses. To bleed the Nepryadva river.
It is curious that until the 19th century no one tried to look for the place of the battle. It was discovered in 1820 by a certain landowner Nechayev, who, having read the chronicles, compared names of the rivers and decided that it was right here that Russian soldiers fought with the Tatars. Needless to say that the Kulikovo field was located just on the territory of his estate. Academic science surprisingly quickly recognized Nechaev's sensational discovery. However, how reasonable is the assumption that it was right in these regions that the troops of Prince Dmitry Ivanovich and Khan Mamai met in a bloody slaughter? Let's go back to the original sources. Among the names mentioned in the annals, Don and Nepryadva are especially common. These two rivers merge south of Moscow in the Tula region. The upper reaches of the Don, the mouth of the Nepryadva and the Razdolnoy field. This geographical triangle hypnotizes historians who study the circumstances of the Battle of Kulikovo so much that they simply do not notice other references to the area.
If we take a look today at the Kulikovo field near Tula, then we will not find almost anything of these names there. Obviously, the Don River flows there and there is a river called Nepryadva. An interesting question is when it got this name. Because on really old maps of the 17th century and in old texts of the 17th-18th centuries, we did not find an indication that the Nepryadva River was there. So, indeed, this river has been known since the time of Nechaev.
In addition, big problems arise in identifying the Red Hill, which is repeatedly mentioned in the primary sources. Meanwhile, it is not at all a minor detail. It was on this hill that the headquarters of the Horde army was located. It was from here that Mamai, together with the three princes, led the actions of his warriors. In the vicinity of the Kulikovo field in the Tula region, historians managed to find one small hill. However, firstly, it obviously is rather small in size, and secondly, it would turn out to be a very poor place for the location of a military headquarters.
To call this small elevation a hill would simply be against the rules of the Russian language, from which, by the way, it was impossible to observe the battle. Because if the battle took place at the confluence of today's Don and today's Nepryadva, then, being on the Red Hill on this elevation, you could not even see anything even with binoculars, not to mention the fact that there were no binoculars at that time.
If the mountain will not come to Muhammad, Muhammad must go to the mountain. That is, if that elevation is too far from the intended place of the battle, then the place itself needs to be moved closer. This elegant solution looks quite logical and removes some contradictions, but immediately generates others.
This is far enough from the confluence of the Don and Nepryadva. Meanwhile, in the chronicles it is directly stated and, in addition, for example, in the illustrated chronicle of Ivan the Terrible, it is clearly depicted that the battle took place exactly at the confluence of the Nepryadva River with the Don.
The further we dig into geography and history, the more inconsistencies we will find. Today's Kulikovo field and its vicinity bear little resemblance to those places that were described in the Zadonshchina, the region beyond the Don River, and other documents that have come down to us. If we also take into account absence of serious material evidence, then a logical question arises. So, maybe the landowner Nechaev was mistaken and it was a wishful thinking on his part? Maybe representatives of traditional science hurried to recognize his discovery? But if not here, then where? Where to look for traces of the great battle? It would seem that in the annals there is one geographical reference, which should not raise any doubts. This is River Don. And it is quite logical to look for the Kulikovo field on the banks of this Russian river, in places where small tributaries flow into it. But it turns out that not everything is so simple here either. Indeed, in many Slavic languages, Don is not a proper name, but an outdated synonym for the word river.
And this is clearly seen from the names of the largest rivers. This is the Don, the modern Don, quiet Don, a quiet river. This is the Dnieper, that is the easy Don. This is the Dniester, that is the streamy Don. This is the Danube, and so on and so forth. The root Don is everywhere here.
Now the circle of search has expanded significantly. On the other hand, it is clear that the battle could not take place at a considerable distance from Moscow.
According to the chronicles, the soldiers of Dmitry Donskoy left the Kremlin on August 9, 1380, and were on the road for no more than a month.
On horseback and on foot, with full armament, they simply could not go far. Russian scientists Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nozovsky have developed a very unusual theory that offers a fresh look at many events in the world and national history. One of their major studies is dedicated to the Battle of Kulikovo. Studying old documents, they stumbled upon a curious mention in the so-called Arkhangelsk Chronicle, dated 1402. The manuscript tells how the residents of ancient Moscow received the icon of the Virgin of Vladimir.
And having brought the icon and met Metropolitan Cyprian with many people on the field of Kulikovo.
The very expression, field of Kulikovo, naturally, is very much in common with the Kulikovo field. It is, in general, just the same. And, sure, we couldn't help but pay attention to such a statement of the chronicler. We knew perfectly well that historians and archaeologists had big problems with the Kulikovo field near Tula. Well, that is, the place that now is considered the site of the Battle of Kulikovo. And, naturally, we were very interested in this testimony.
Kulikovo field, more correctly, Kuligovo, means far field. Now we have such a name in Moscow too. This is Kulishki, at the place where Solyanka is now.
Let us outline the circle of names associated with Kulishki in the center of Moscow. The Church of All Saints at Kulishki.
Slavyanskaya Square.
Solyanka, former Kulishki. The Nativity of the Virgin Mary Church at Kulishki. St. Peter and St. Paul's Church at Kulishki. The Three Holy Hierarchs Church at Kulishki. Former Kulish Gates. An impressive space that would fit 2 huge troops. So, we found a wide field. Now let's see if 2 rivers, large and small, merge in the immediate vicinity. As you might guess, the Moscow River is quite suitable for the role of Don. But what about Nepryadva? It is not on the maps of the capital city. Meanwhile, it is one of the most important geographical landmarks in the annals dedicated to the Battle of Kulikovo. Maybe again one should take a closer look at the name. Nepryadva means not overflowing, limited by something. And next to the capital's Kulishki, a small tributary flows into the Moscow River, whose name is the Yauza.
In essence, the name Yauza is about the same as Nepryadva, but said differently. Because the Yauza is a narrowed river, as if bonds were put on it. That is, the river is somehow constrained, from the word bonds, uzi in Russian, narrowed. Perhaps it did not overflow. Some of its banks were strengthened.
Kulikovo field is the confluence of the Moscow River and the Yauza. New geographic triangle. What is it, a mere coincidence or something more? To confirm or refute the arisen guesses, we turn to the primary sources and consider the chronology of events. As already mentioned, Dmitry Donskoy with his army went on a campaign on August 9, 1380. The route of his movement is quite detailed.
That was a terrifying spectacle. Shouted and yelled and cried all the people of Moscow. The great Prince Dmitry let his brother Vladimir go to Brashov Road, and he himself went to the Kotel.
Let's take a look at the map.
According to the accepted version, Dmitry Ivanovich leaves the Kremlin and moves his troops to Kolomna, which is 100 kilometers from Moscow.
Moreover, Vladimir Andreevich, the cousin of the Grand Duke, goes along the so-called Brezhev Road. And for some reason Dmitry himself turns onto the southern Serpukhov Road, which passes through the village of Kotly and along which the Grand Duke will never be able to get to Kolomna. Academic science interprets this misunderstanding as a chronicler's mistake.
We know that Kolomenskaya is located in the south of Moscow. Then he went to Kotly. Lower Kotly is not far from Kolomenskaya. At this time, Mamai is at Kuzmin Gat, on the other side of the river. And this is Kuzminki. They are really on the other side of the river, and the relative location is exactly as indicated in the annals.
And if you send the prince's troops not from the Kremlin to Kolomna, but in a completely different way, from the village of Kolomenskaya to the nowadays center of Moscow, to the place where, according to our assumptions, the Kulikovo field could be located,
then there is no contradiction. The Grand Duke is moving along the Horde Road, also known as Kolomenskaya, where there is the Kotlovka River and now the Nizhny, Lower, Kotly railway station is located. And the regiments of Vladimir Andreevich are moving along the Borovsk Road. Now it is Borovskaya Highway. To get to Kulishki, Russian troops had to cross the Moscow River, either in the area where the Novodevichy convent is located these days, or a little further north. Let us turn again to the annals to see if there are any mentions of this. The manuscript says, really there was a crossing, and immediately after that, Dmitry arranged something like a military review.
The next morning, the great prince ordered all the soldiers to go to the field to Dvicho. More than 150,000 soldiers joined the ranks, and Dmitry saw such a large militia with spiritual joy.
And indeed, Devichye Pole, Maiden's Field, is located in Moscow. There is the Novodevichy convent. And earlier there was just a Devichy, Maiden, convent and a slightly different place, well, approximately in the same place. This means that the names of the streets still remain the same. Passage of the Devichy Pole. Then, there is the Brezhev Road, along which Vladimir Andreevich approached. It corresponds to the Borovskaya Road on the Moscow map.
The time of a bloody battle is inevitably approaching.
Russians and Mongol Tatars are closing in. They go towards their fate, death or glory.
September 5, 1380, 3 days before beginning of the battle, Mamai with his army finds himself on Kuzmin Gat. We will not find such a name on the map of the Tula version of the Kulikovo field. However, it is too early to talk about another mistake of the chroniclers. Let's look at the map of Moscow first. No need to be a historian to suggest that, perhaps, Kuzmin Gat is the well-known metropolitan Kuzminki district. Here the Moskva River overflowed, forming a swamp. The troops of Grand Duke Dmitry and Mamai stood in close proximity to each other, but they were separated by impenetrable swamps.
Therefore, the opponents were forced to continue moving north in search of a convenient place to fight.
The last night before the battle. In these anxious hours, as the chronicles say, the Russian troops receive a good sign.
A certain man, named Foma Hisheviev, was placed as a watchman by the Grand Duke on the Chura-Mihailov River. And God assured him and revealed to him to see a great vision in the night. 2 young men came. Their bright faces shone like the sun. In their hands they held sharp swords.
The next morning, Foma told Dmitry about his insight, who regarded this as the appearance of the holy martyrs Boris and Gleb and began to pray for their help. And the morale of the Russian troops was even more strengthened. Today, not many Moscow old-timers know that the small river Chura flows not far from the Danilov Monastery. It has become shallow, and you can see it only after passing through the old Tatar cemetery. Curiously, Mihailovo is mentioned in the annals. And next to Chura in Moscow there is a bunch of Mihailovsky streets. This circumstance is hardly a coincidence. Most likely, there used to be a village with a similar name. As for the generally recognized Kulikovo field and its surroundings, there is no Chura river flowing through Mihailovo there. Another argument in favor of the Moscow version. September 8, 1380. The date known today to every school student, the day of the Battle of Kulikovo. Russians and Mongol Tatars are separated by a wide field and either by the Nepryadva River, or by the Yauza. Mamai and his headquarters were located on Red Hill. As we could see, a small elevation, discovered in the Tula region, to put it mildly, is not a very good place for coordinating hostilities. In modern topography of Moscow, with its high-rise buildings and straight avenues, it is difficult to see hills and depressions, but 6 centuries ago, the current Taganskaya Square was the highest place in the center. Today, this hill has no name, but in ancient times it could well be called red, that is, beautiful, distinguished by its size. Like echoes of those times, geographical landmarks that have survived to this day.
Red Hill Embankment, Red Hill Bridge, Krasnohomsky in Russian.
Is it really again a pure coincidence, or such a number of coincidences already allows us to talk about patterns? There are other high hills not far from the Kremlin. From one of them, Dmitry Donskoy could direct maneuvers of his troops.
As for the field near Tula, there is no position at all for Dmitry Donskoy's headquarters. There is no even an elevation similar to the alleged Red Hill, which they present as Mamai's headquarters. Therefore, historians hold on to the opinion that Dmitry Donskoy did not have a headquarters. He gave his armor to someone else, and he went there himself to fight. Thus, it turns out that the army of Dmitry Donskoy, according to their version, as a matter of fact fought like a mob by itself without a uniform command, without a uniform headquarters. And yet, they won such a colossal battle. But it looks like a fairy tale, to be honest.
The battle opened with a single combat between 2 champions, Purisavet and Chelubey.
A huge Tatar came out of the great Tatar regiment. Seeing him, the monk Alexander Perizovich rode out of the Russian regiment and said, "This man is looking for his equal. I want to meet him." And he mounted his horse and rushed at the Tatar. And they hit hard with spears, and broke the spears, and both fell from their horses to the ground dead, and their horses fell.
And then the rest of the warriors joined in.
According to the chroniclers, the battle lasts all day.
By evening, both troops are suffering heavy losses. Exhausted, bleeding warriors already hardly hold swords in their hands, but still fight for life and death. It seemed that luck was turning away from the Russians. They have to retreat. A bit more and the Outlanders will be able to turn the tide of battle in their favor. But at this decisive moment, soldiers from the regiment of Prince Vladimir Andreevich appear on the Kulikovo field, who were hiding in ambush for several hours.
They left the green oak forest, as skillful falcons struck the flocks of cranes. The wicked saw them and said, "We have been outwitted. The worst fought with us, but the valiant survived."
Let's check if there is a suitable place for an ambush on the field, which today is considered Kulikovo.
Gully Green Oak Forest. It is right there. The Green Oak Forest itself does not exist. During the time of Peter the Great, when he visited these places, during the construction of the flotilla, he saw those very oaks and ordered these oaks to be marked in order to be preserved for posterity. Oaks disappeared by the 19th century, but the gully, where this oak forest was, it has retained its name to this day. It is there.
But, by all means, one has to try hiding there. There's a small oak grove there, right on the battlefield, well, a bit of a narrow strip of trees. And in this narrow strip, a large enough ambush to defeat Mamai's army allegedly hid. Well, Mamai and his commanders must be completely blind not to see such a large enemy unit that is hiding among a few oak trees, well, right in plain sight. It turns out that the Mamai soldiers were very unprofessional military men. On the other hand, chronicles say that Mamai's army was exceptionally professional and very powerful.
A monument to the event that decided the outcome of the Great Battle has been preserved in Moscow. The Church of St. Vladimir in the Gardens still stands at Kulishki. The name speaks for itself. And there is every reason to believe that the place for the construction of such a monument was not chosen by chance.
The warriors of Mamai pressed the troops of Dmitry Donskoy and went forward, approximately to Slavyanskaya Square. And then, from the hill that descends from the Church of St. Vladimir, this is where the monastery of St. John is now, Vladimir Andreevich's ambush hit them in the rear. This hill descends to Kulishki with its southern slope. The southern slopes of the hills were always heavily overgrown, and subsequently gardens were planted there. Hence the name Old Garden, Starosatsky Lane. On such a large and densely overgrown hill, the soldiers of Vladimir Andreevich could be hiding. Moreover, they were at a height and rather far away. Namely, the very famous ambush that struck in the rear just as the Mamai soldiers advanced towards Red Square. And then they were smashed and pressed against the Yauza, against the Moscow River. There, many drowned and were driven on.
Further, according to Nozovsky and Fomenko, the Mongol Tatars were defeated and pressed against the Yauza or the Moscow River. Trying to cross to the other side, many of them drowned. And those who survived, just fled from the battlefield. Thus, the great battle ended with the unconditional victory of the Russian army.
In fact, old images portray the Kulikovo field as being surrounded by hills. Mamai sits on a hill, Vladimir Andreevich's ambush hid on another hill. Dmitry's headquarters is on one more hill. There are many of these hills around Kulishki. This is Tagonsky Hill, going up to the St. Vladimir's church. This is the hill on which Red Square is located. These are all hills descending to the confluence of the Yauza and the Moscow River. And at this confluence, such a low-lying area arises. In fact, that was the place of the battle. Sure, this is impressive that there is such an ideal correspondence between Moscow geographical names and Kulikovo, taken from the chronicles. And when we encountered this, we were also amazed at the degree of preservation of Moscow names that speak of the Battle of Kulikovo and those mentioned in the annals.
7 ancient churches today surround Moscow's Kulishki at the confluence of the Yauza with the Moscow River. The Church of All Saints at Kulishki, built in memory of the fallen on September 8, 1380. The Church of St. Cosmas and Damian, founded under Dmitry Donskoy. The Three Holy Hierarchs Church at Kulishki. St. Peter and St. Paul's Church at Kulishki.
The Church of the Life-Giving Trinity. The Nativity of the Virgin Mary Church at Kulishki.
In addition, already mentioned the Church of St. Vladimir in the Gardens and the Nativity of the Virgin Mary Church in the Kremlin, founded by Grand Duchess Evdokia in honor of her husband's victory. We have listed only the surviving spiritual monuments, but how many of them have sunk into oblivion? How can the Tula region boast of such a variety of temples lit by the flames of the great Kulikovo battle? The victory, of course, was unconditional. However, a high price had to be paid.
We do not have 40 boyars of Moscow, and 12 princes of Belaruski, and 13 boyars posadniks, mayors, of Novgorod, and 35 boyars of Vladimir, and 40 boyars of Murom. But young people cannot be counted.
The words of the legend sound like a death knell, and another quote.
The great prince stood up in the middle of the field and said, weeping and sobbing, "Brothers, now let us do this. Everyone will bury his neighbor." For 8 days they stood on the Don, until they separated the Christian bodies from the unholy. The bodies of Christians were buried in the ground, the unholy bodies were thrown to the beasts and birds to be torn to pieces.
In total, 12 Russian princes, 483 boyars and tens of thousands of ordinary soldiers died in the Battle of Kulikovo. And we again come back to the question, where are the remains of the dead heroes buried, if they were not found in the Tula region? Since the battle took place on the Mariamas, the birth of the Virgin Mary, then, in theory, the Nativity of the Virgin Mary Temple should have been built at the burial site. A church with this name can be found today in Moscow on the territory of the Simonov Monastery, founded, by the way, in 1379, just on the eve of the Battle of Kulikovo. Moreover, information has been preserved that it is here that the graves of the Russian heroes Purosavet and Oslyobya are located.
According to documents that have been known since the time of Karamzin, it is well known that Oslyobya and Purosavet were buried precisely on the territory of the Simonov Monastery. And initially on their grave there was a tombstone laid in the 14th century, on which some inscriptions were made. The history of this tombstone, as well as the burial as a whole, is very mysterious, foggy and interesting. Karamzin also noted that he was not familiar with the text on the tombstone of Oslyobya and Purosavet.
In general, there are many tragic pages in the history of the Nativity of the Virgin Mary Church. This is an 18th century drawing. It clearly shows that the former appearance of the temple is significantly different from present day. The church was rebuilt in the 19th century. Probably, during the reconstruction, inscriptions and frescoes telling about the Mamai battle could have been destroyed if they were different from the official account. In 1870, a cast-iron tombstone was installed on the graves of Purosavet and Oslyobya. But this tombstone was not so lucky either. In 1928, the territory of the Simonov Monastery was absorbed by the dynamo plant. The temple was closed, and the tomb was sold as scrap metal for 317 rubles 25 kopecks. The information that the graves of these famous warriors are in Moscow is not refuted by academic science, but it gives its own explanation to this fact. Allegedly, the bodies of Purosavet and Oslyobya were merely transported from the Tula region to Moscow and buried here in the capital city. Perhaps they did the same with the noble dead heroes, of which, we recall, there were about 500. However, firstly, it is not clear how the bleeding Russian troops could carry out such a large-scale transportation. Secondly, the living buried the dead for 8 days and only then went to Moscow, 300 kilometers from the alleged battlefield. Really, the remains of the dead have not been buried for several weeks?
Their bodies were poured with honey. Somehow, they were taken away. I would say they were making ridiculous manipulations. After all major battles, the burial is always on the battlefield.
However, let us again come back to the Simonov Monastery. If the graves of Purosavet and Oslyobya are really located here, then maybe it makes sense to look for the burial places of other participants in the battle? In 1996, it was decided to dig a cellar for household needs on the territory of the monastery. However, the work was stopped as soon as it began, as the diggers stumbled upon a massive accumulation of fragments of human skeletons. There were so many horrifying finds that they could hardly fit in a huge wooden box.
The workers who dug this cellar explained to us that the bones were in complete disarray. One skeleton was upside down. That is, this is clearly not a monastery burial, in which, firstly, there could not be so many bones in one place. Then, they had to lie more consistently. There would be coffins or remains of coffins. No, it was a chaotic, huge accumulation of skeletons. And, moreover, another striking thing that drew their attention, it was that the skulls were young. They had all teeth, not worn out, meaning that these were young, healthy people when they died. All this suggests that this is really a military burial place.
In addition, in the ground a few similar tombstones were found with the same unusual pattern.
Now it is hard to recollect the total number, but we personally saw the remains of 5 or 6 tombstones, which are still kept on the territory of the Simonov Monastery. Of these, some are split, but some are quite well preserved. One such tombstone lies right in the center of the monastery. And what struck us was what we saw on them. At that time it was a completely new to us, interesting and previously unfamiliar symbol. This is a forked cross. In the 12th and 16th centuries, crosses in many ways were different from what we see today. The most typical were images of the Holy Cross in form of the modern letter T and in form of the letter gamma. Apparently, they simulated the old form of crucifixion. Then, in the era of the Romanovs, when a religious reform was carried out, customs, rituals, and religious symbols themselves were partly changed. These forms of crosses became a thing of the past.
Another discovery was made in the center of Moscow. In the middle of the 18th century, at Kulishki, a stone building of an orphanage was built on the personal order of Catherine the Great. The imposing building occupied an area of about 15 hectares. During the Patriotic War of 1812, the French set up here a hospital for their soldiers. And today, the Peter the Great Military Academy is located in this building.
When I was a cadet, the detachment in which I studied participated in cleaning consequences of a certain housekeeping accident. A wall in the basement broke through. All the dirt, slush poured inside. As always, they threw cadets for purging, with shovels and hand barrows. And the cadets discovered that all this was quite thickly mixed with human bones. This fact did not remain, of course, in the dark. We talked about it with our academic historians. We had an extensive history course at the academy.
This fact was immediately made public. However, historians, for some reason, were not interested. They stated without a shadow of a doubt, most likely, the cadets stumbled upon remains of the French, who died of wounds in 1812.
From the information that is available, in a wasteland near the Kitai-Gorod Wall, that is, outside the territory of the modern academy, even if they were buried somewhere on the territory of the academy, then not under the very foundations. In fact, it broke right through the interior, that is, the bones are located directly under the building itself, which had already stood for more than 50 years at the time of the War of 1812.
None of the representatives of academic science has bothered to check what kind of mass graves are located under the foundation of the former orphanage and on the territory of the Simonov Monastery. Or, at least, find out what era these necropolises belong to. Unfortunately, there is no talk today about systematic excavations in the center of the capital city. Such work is quite difficult to organize, and it will be expensive. But archaeological research in the center of Moscow, in the Kulishki region, is almost the only chance to find out the truth. Now scientists can only put forward versions and speculate based on inferences, since the documents and evidence that have come down to us have been subjected to numerous revisions. Many primary sources have been lost, and some have been deliberately destroyed.
According to Nozovsky and Fomenko, purposeful work on a total revision of national history began in the 17th century as part of the so-called reformist activities of the first representatives of the Romanov dynasty.
Our experience with old monuments shows that the old tombstones in Russian history before the 17th century are basically almost all destroyed. They all perished and died because they had symbols that were rejected by the Romanovs, replaced by them with the new symbolism of the reformist time of the 17th century. And in order to remove these traces as much as possible, in particular, a large-scale campaign was undertaken to destroy old tombstones. As part of this campaign, most likely, the tombstone of Oslyabya and Peresavet was destroyed.
You haven't shaved off your beard yet, have you? In Europe, they laugh at beards.
Such large-scale transformations could have been caused both by religious motives and by the desire to bring Russian historical science in line with new Western standards.
Allegedly, in Russia before the era of Peter the Great, in general, before the era of the Romanovs, there was no cartography of its own. Existing maps of Moscow are made by foreigners. Sigismund's plans and maps of O'Leary and other travelers who were in Moscow before the 17th century are known. However, for some reason, today we don't see old Russian maps. True, they refer to the supposedly existed Godunov drawing, the plan made under Godunov, but it hasn't survived. Old documents, old maps, first of all, of the Russian Horde Empire, apparently, often unconditionally contradicted the new Romanov version. Because they depicted the geography of Russia, the geography of Europe, the geography of the world, which was at odds with the new geography created in Western Europe by the Scaliger school and in our country by the Romanov school of historians.
If a global historical cleansing was really carried out, then a natural question arises.
It may be that not only information about the place of the Battle of Kulikovo and the burial places of fallen soldiers turned out to be distorted. Perhaps it is worth taking a closer look at other details of events hidden from us in the depths of centuries. It's possible that in this case we are in for unexpected results. The Yaroslavl Museum keeps an old icon dating back to the middle of the 17th century. A unique image of the Battle of Kulikovo. We do not know for how many centuries this image has lain in oblivion. According to the technology of icon painting, the image was covered with drying oil, which had properties of gradually darkening. Approximately after 100 years, an icon without restoration became completely black and a new one was painted on top of the disappeared image, which did not always coincide with the previous one. When in the 20th century they learned how to remove old layers using chemicals, many initial stories were revealed. The same thing happened with this icon. Only in 1959 the image of the Battle of Kulikovo was revealed. The masterpiece of Yaroslavl painting will tell a lot of interesting things to an attentive and unbiased eye. Here are the troops of Mamai crossing the river, descending from a high hill. There are no such height differences on the plains of the Tula region. But the red hill in Moscow exactly matches the image of the icon painter. But the most intriguing thing is that on the Yaroslavl icon there are no significant differences between the Tatar and Russian troops. The same faces, the same colors. And on these colors is the image of the vernacle, who since time immemorial was considered the patron of Russian soldiers.
According to our reconstruction, there were both Russians and Tatars on both sides. In general, at that time there was no division into nations in the modern sense, it was all mixed up and more unified. And we see that these old images convey a completely different version of history than the one we know today from textbooks of the Romanovs' history.
Moreover, some documents say that the Volga Tatars were reluctant to serve Mamai and there were few of them in his army. And the Poles, Crimeans, Jasses, Kasogs and Genoese fought for Mamai, who were also involved in the financial support of his campaign. Meanwhile, the baptized Tatars, along with the Lithuanians, fought on the side of Dmitry. As you know, the army of Mamai is called a horde. However, the Russian army is also called exactly the same. Here is a quote from Zadanshchina.
Why are you, filthy Mamai, encroaching on the Russian land? Did not the Zaleski horde beat you?
The Vladimir Suzdalian Principality was called the Zaleski land. So maybe the word horde simply means an army, and not the Tatar hordes, as we used to understand? But who then, in reality, was Mamai? According to the chronicle, he was a temnik, captain of 10,000, or a Tisyatsky, captain of 1,000, that is, a military leader. A few years before the Battle of Kulikovo, he betrays his Khan and tries to seize power. The very similar story happened with Grand Duke Dmitry Ivanovich in Moscow, and it was even taking place at the same time. The son of a Tisyatsky, Ivan Velyaminov, having quarreled with Dmitry, flees to the horde, and there he prepares for a campaign against his ruler. It is easy to see that the actions of the Tisyatskys in the history of the Battle of Kulikovo somehow strangely duplicate each other.
According to the chronicles, Ivan Velyaminov, the traitor, who appeared in the Russian land, will be executed right on the Kulikovo field after Dmitry's victory.
In memory of this event, the Grand Duke will even order minting of coins.
On the coins of Donskoy there was an image of the prince himself, who holds a sword and shield in his hand, and a defeated enemy lies at his feet. It's a man whose head has been cut off. It is known that Ivan Velyaminov was executed, his head was cut off. This coin records the fact of Donskoy's victory over his enemy.
Dmitry and his opponent with swords in their hands. A few minutes more and a bloody battle will begin. And on the reverse of the coin, a man with a shield. But do they hold a shield during an execution? It turns out that Tisyatsky Velyaminov died on the battlefield. According to the generally accepted version, after defeat, Mamai fled to the steppes and the same year faced a new enemy, Tahtamish, the Khan of the Zayatsky horde. They met on the banks of the Kalka, where history repeated itself exactly. As on the Kulikovo field, poor Mamai was betrayed by his Lithuanian ally and was defeated. Considering that vowels were not used in the ancient chronicles, the names Kalka and Kulikovo are not just similar, but absolutely identical and consist of only 3 letters: K, L and K. In addition, coins have been preserved, on which Khan Tahtamish is engraved on one face in Arabic, and on reverse in Russian, Grand Duke Dmitry Donskoy. Historians are trying to explain this by the fact that these coins were minted by Tahtamish on one face and by Dmitry Donskoy on the other.
In our opinion, this can be explained in a different way, namely, that several languages were used in Russia: Russian, Arabic, Tatar, and on the same coin the name of the same ruler could be minted on both, obverse and reverse, in 2 different languages. From our point of view, there is nothing surprising in this. Therefore, the presence of such coins is a fairly strong argument in favor of the fact that Dmitry Donskoy and Khan Tahtamish is the same person.
So maybe there were no 2 different battles that are similar like 2 peas in a pod? And there was just one on the Kulikovo field, where Prince Dmitry Donskoy, aka the Great Khan Tahtamish, defeated troops of the traitor Ivan Velyaminov, also known as Mamai. But in this case, an even more unexpected question arises. Was there ever a Mongol-Tatar yoke? In light of new assumptions, it appears that there was not. But there was a huge Russian horde empire, which in the second half of the 14th century was divided into 3 parts. Golden Horde, White Horde or White Russia, and Little Russia, also known as the Blue Horde. The Golden Horde, another name for the Volga Kingdom, falls into a long and dangerous turmoil. In 21 years, 25 rulers are replaced. There is a fierce struggle for the throne, which in 1380 is resolved by a grandiose battle on the Kulikovo field. The history of the distant 14th century needs further research and, most importantly, search for new documents and material evidence unknown to science. They can confirm or refute the theories that exist today. However, once again, there are undeniable facts.
The Battle of Kulikovo really took place.
It took place in 1380, and Dmitry Donskoy won it. And, certainly, it is rightfully considered a symbol of courage, valor and honor of Russian soldiers. And one more interesting detail. In our time, in the center of Moscow on Krasnoholmskaya embankment, a cross has been erected, and its granite base has engraving. A monument to the holy noble Prince Dmitry Donskoy, the defender of the Russian land, will be erected at this place.
In the summer of 1992, September 25th.
Back then the sculptor could not know about the Moscow version of the battle. It was not yet formulated. But it so happened that the memorial cross is right in place where the legendary Kulikovo field could be located.